The telegraph can be said to represent the beginning of the electronic age, the predecessor to a modern-day cell phone. But while Samuel Morse might have presaged the importance of the electronic era in 1844 when he famously telegraphed the words, "What hath God wrought?" it might surprise you to find out that the word telegraph had actually been coined a half-century before. Attempts to develop technology that allows speedy long-distance communication go all the way back to antiquity, and they reached their pre-electric peak in the telegraph before Morse's telegraph. Because before wires crossed the world, Napoleonic France could send a message from Paris to Lille, a distance of about 250 kilometers, in just 10 minutes. The Napoleon telegraph is a nearly forgotten part of the history of the development of communications technology that deserves to be remembered. In the 4th century BC, Aeneas Tacticus, a Greek writer on the art of war, invented a device similar to a water clock that could be used as a means of distance communication. The Greek historian Polybius described the device, which he said had been used in the First Punic War. People manning two stations within sight of each other would have identically sized jars with identically sized holes in the bottom. It would fill the jars with water and place inside, quote, a rod graduated in equal section of 3-finger breadths, each clearly marked off from the next. In each section should be written the most evident and ordinary events that occur in war, e.g. on the first, cavalry arrived to the country, and the second, heavy infantry, and on the third, light-armed infantry, and next infantry and cavalry, and next ships, and next corn, and so on until we've entered in all the sections, the chief contingencies of which at the present time, there is reasonable probability in wartime. When communicating a message, a man would hold up a torch as a signal to release the plug in the hole. When sufficient water had drained to uncover the word he wished to convey, he would again signal with the torch. As the jars emptied at the same rate, the person receiving the message would see which word had been uncovered. A system of optical distance communication might have been in use even earlier in China as part of the defense system of the Great Wall. Beacon towers were built at regular intervals along the wall, whose construction began as early as 700 BC. Fire or smoke produced in one tower could be seen by the next to pass the message along. One legend suggests that the Western Zhou dynasty fell partly because its king misused the system, tricking his own army by falsely sending the alarm in order to amuse his concubine. Communication using signal fires was recorded in several cultures. Caesar, for example, noted in his commentaries that Gauls used signal fires at night to warn of his approach. While not always accurately represented by Hollywood, according to the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian, native peoples of the Americas did use smoke signals, although they note it was not an entire language, and not all tribes used them. All these means would have had the same limitations. As they were visual, they would be limited to the distance of sight, although a message could be passed vast distances using a series of signaling stations. Their use would have been limited where visual conditions were bad, such as in bad weather, and some would not have been useful at night. But they also would have been limited in the range of messages that could be conveyed. Aeneas' system was limited to about a dozen words. On the Great Wall, the online China travel guide notes, lining of one woodpile indicated that the coming of enemies was less than 1,000, 2 woodpiles indicated over 1,000 enemies, and 3 woodpiles indicated over 1,000 enemies were attacking the barrier right at that moment. While that would undoubtedly have been useful in mobilizing a defense, its value would have been limited to specific situations. But in the 18th century, and largely due to the development of the telescope, new systems were devised that allowed long-distance visual communication to send a much broader range of messages. And of those, the first that can be said to be truly successful was developed in France, the same place where 18 centuries earlier, the Gauls had used signal fires to warn of Caesar's invasion. Claude Chappe was born on Christmas Day, 1763. A secure position in the clergy allowed him to maintain a small laboratory where he could do experiments in physics, but that position was lost during the French Revolution. Out of work, he and his brothers began work on a visual communication system utilizing the telescope. The idea was not new and had, according to the website History Computer, been proposed at least a century earlier, although the system had not been developed. The newspaper Railroad Telegrapher wrote in 1894 that Claude and his brothers had been educated at different colleges that were some distance from, but within view of each other. And to communicate with him, he arranged a series of signals from his dormitory window, which, being understood, were answered according to a code. This was evidently the foundation of Chappe's invention. The newspaper notes that the story might be apocryphal, but is a decidedly pretty and natural legend. The brothers experimented with a number of different ideas. Claude's brother Abraham wrote that they tried unsuccessfully to use electricity, various acoustic methods, and smoke produced by different kinds of combustibles, etc. Eventually, they settled on a system using two synchronized pendulum clocks. The pendulums would be started at the same time, rotating a dial that had several symbols on it. Ignace Chappe, another one of the brothers, described the system. When the pointer of one clock passed over the number one wanted to indicate, a sound was made, announcing to the correspondent that the number which also his pointer indicated at the moment that sound was heard was significant. The symbols could be read via a codebook. Ignace continued, by representing the words in a dictionary with successive numbers, one could thus transmit any thought. The system was demonstrated March 2nd, 1791, between two towns approximately 16 kilometers apart. Another brother, René, sent the message given to him by a local official. "If you succeed, you will soon bask in glory." An official report of the demonstration that said, while continuously keeping his eye on the telescope, Claude successively dictated the message within the space of 4 minutes. Despite the successful demonstration and the clear value of such a device during an era when revolutionary France was beset by enemies, the Chappe brothers may still not have obtained government support, except that one of the brothers, Ignace, was elected to the National Assembly and became the project's champion. Claude obtained permission to create a prototype for a demonstration, asking only, in case of success, to be reimbursed for the expenses that are made. The brothers continued experimenting with new ideas, and it being revolutionary France, they had two prototypes destroyed by angry mobs who thought that they were trying to communicate with royalists. They developed a second system that used moving panels that allowed a broader range of communication than the first, but that system too was quickly replaced. In 2013, BBC News wrote about the Chappe's final system. Born into a family of scientists in western France, Claude Chappe made the important observation that the human eye is excellent at discerning angles. Chappe's design used a large horizontal beam with two smaller wings mounted at the ends. History Computer writes, the angles of the indicators, and independently also the position of the large regular beam, could be varied in increments of 45 degrees, sufficient for the encoding of hundreds of symbols. The wings, or indicators, used counterweight so that they could be moved quickly, and the beams were all painted black to increase contrast against the sky. Chappe originally called the device the tachygraph, roughly translating from Greek fast writer, but it was another term that was coined by French statesman André de Melito that the army preferred. That was telegraph, meaning far writer. Chappe also devised another term for his device, semaphore, meaning signal bearer. The new device was demonstrated July 12, 1793, using 3 stations covering a total of 26 kilometers. It took 11 minutes to transmit a message that would have taken a messenger on horseback an hour. BBC News writes, it was the world's first ever system of telegraphy. Impressed, the National Convention, which had by then replaced the Assembly, decided to create a state telegraph line and gave Claude the title Telegraph Engineer. They gave he and 3 of his brothers a salary to establish a line from Paris to Lille. The brothers were, History Computer writes, given blanket permission to place telegraphs in any belfries, towers, or emplacements of their choosing. They also had permission to remove any trees that interfered with the line of vision between the stations. The line from Paris to Lille, some 230 kilometers long, consisted of 15 towers and was completed by May 1794. Professor J. M. Delac of the National Institute of Science Applications in Toulouse explains that a famous clockmaker designed and built a control mechanism, allowing an operator using a scaled-down model of the semaphore to remotely align the full-scaled one from the inside of a building using pulleys and ropes. It came at an important time for France, as the railroad telegrapher writes. Struggling Republican France was at war with nearly the whole of Europe, whipping her foes from the Teutons in the north to the English in the south, which then occupied Toulon, only to be driven out by a then obscure olive-cheeked lieutenant named Bonaparte. One of the first messages noted from the new system was the following August. Conde de Repris, meaning the fortress of Conde, taken by Austria in 1793, had been recaptured. BBC explains the significance of the message. From the outset, the prime purpose of the system was military. 4 years into the revolution, with fears growing of foreign invasion to restore the monarchy, the Republican government commissioned Citizen Chappe to build the first line from Paris to Lille. A year later, in September 1794, the government heard news on the day it happened that the northern border town of Conde had been captured. They telegraphed back their congratulations, which were received in Conde the same evening. Railroad telegrapher writes, from that moment, aerial telegraphy was a triumph for France. The online Low-Tech magazine writes, the technology today might sound a bit absurd, but in those times the optical telegraph was a genuine revolution. The transmission of one symbol from Paris to Lille could happen in 10 minutes, which comes down to a speed of 1,380 kilometers an hour. faster than a modern passenger plane. Chappe continued refining both the coding system and the process for the stations, each set about 10 kilometers apart with telescopes facing 2 directions. BBC News writes, in each hut, a single operator had the task of surveying his neighbors by telescope. As soon as there was activity, he copied down the signals and passed them on. Of the meaning of the message, the operator had not a clue. He merely worked the machine. For the operators, it was tiring and laborious, especially as they had pay docked for delays. Still, by all accounts, they acquitted themselves well. Professor Dillock notes that it appears that records show at Paris, signals were received from Lille in 2 minutes, from Brest in 6 minutes, and from Toulon in 12 minutes, although he explains these are very probably the best results obtained with fine weather. The system figures into the plot of Alexander Dumas's 1844 novel, The Count of Monte Cristo, which marvels that these various signs should be made to cleave the air with such precision as to convey to the distance of 300 leagues the ideas and wishes of a man sitting at a table. After 1799, that man was likely Napoleon Bonaparte, who after seizing power in a coup d'etat in 1799 sent the message, "Paris is quiet and the good citizens are content," along the growing line. Bonaparte recognized the value of the system, so much so that he had an exceptionally large tower built for signaling across the English Channel in preparation for a planned invasion of England, as well as commissioning portable devices to support his invasion of Russia in 1812. The system was used so effectively during the Napoleonic Wars that it was often called the Napoleon Telegraph. In 1811, the system was used to announce the birth of Napoleon's son, with the news reaching Strasbourg, nearly 500 kilometers away, in 60 minutes. The telegraph Chappe lasted long after Napoleon's final exile in 1815, and by 1850 France had 556 stations, covering nearly 5,000 kilometers. It was even used in one of the first cases of wire fraud, as History Computer explains. In 1834, 2 bankers, the brothers Francois and Joseph Blanc, had bribed the telegraph operators at a station just behind Tours to indicate a specific pattern of errors into the transmissions, to signal the direction in which the stock market was moving in Paris to an accomplice in Bordeaux. The fraud had been in operation for more than 2 years before it was discovered in 1836. Although Professor Dillock notes, very much like the difficulty in regulating the internet today, that the men were acquitted at trial because they had broken no explicit law. Because the system was so extensive, it survived the initial invention of the electronic telegraph, only slowly being replaced. In 1855, during the war in the Crimea, the optical telegraph was used to pass the news of the fall of Sevastopol. One person who did not live to see the success of the Chappe telegraph was Claude Chappe. Illness, worried that the telegraph was not getting commercial customers, and accusations that he had stolen the idea aggravated what was called an already melancholy personality, and in 1805 he committed suicide by throwing himself down a well. Other optical telegraph systems were built in many places, in the United Kingdom, Sweden, Ireland, Spain, Canada, and the United States, although none were as extensive as the French system. The system of flag semaphore, still used by navies in certain conditions today, was ultimately derived from Chappe's optical telegraph system. Remains of Chappe telegraph stations can be found across France. Although many are derelict, around a dozen have been restored, and 6 are protected as historical monuments. So how important really are those just over 5 decades between when Chappe successfully made his demonstration in 1791 and when Morse sent his message in 1844? Perhaps more than you think. Economist Todd Standage noted in 2014 that the Chappe telegraph was the mother of all networks, and it operated sort of as a mechanical internet. Professor Dillock concludes, it's worth noting that while modern data networks are faster, bigger, and more reliable, they're not intrinsically all that different. They're still designed using principles that were developed by men who were born and educated in the 18th century. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguideguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.